Hello, everyone, and welcome to World Oregon's virtual program, We Protest, Fighting for What We Believe in. We're excited about the impressive panel that we have today. We welcome you to join us for this virtual program, which is going to be recorded for posterity and put up on YouTube. So mind your P's and Q's and the questions. As all of our programs are free currently for World Oregon members, we thank those who are members who are helping to support this and make it possible. If you're not a World Oregon member, I encourage you to visit us at worldoregon.org. We thank all of our presenters here today, which I will introduce briefly. Detailed versions of their bios are on our website, worldoregon.org. We will then show a short video that gives an overview of Tish's book. And then Tish and our other panelists will begin discussions. For those of you who have not joined us on one of these Zoom webinars before, you can put in a question in the Q&A function on Zoom, and Tim DeRoche, our program director, will moderate that later on in the program. We will also be posting in the chat occasional links for some of the materials, be they books or digital resources, for you to follow up and look at. So first, just a brief statement that I wanted to make, given everything that's going on in the world, and just sort of reiterating some of the points I made during our programs back in June. World Oregon's mission, the core of our 70-year-old legacy as an organization, is about bridging the gaps between us. As an organization with a global mission to connect Oregon with the world, it's not easy to know what to do in the face of injustice in our own backyard, like the recent shooting of Jacob Blake, the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and countless other Black people by police. We have our own reckoning to do as Americans, as an organization based in Oregon, a state with its own racist history. In World Oregon fashion, we started out with a conversation. On June 11th, we hosted a virtual panel discussion about the role of international organizations and World Oregon specifically in addressing anti-Black injustices and combating systemic racism, and how this moment can be a fulcrum for real change. It was an honest and challenging, vital conversation, and I encourage you to watch it on World Oregon's YouTube channel if you missed it live. Today's program continues this discussion and includes local expert Eric Ward, who also spoke as part of an April 27th program on countering extremism in the age of quarantine. That is also up on our YouTube channel. This is fundamentally what our work is about and why our organization was founded in 1950, because then our founders saw the need for dialogue and openness to learn from each other in order to combat isolationism, to connect and be part of a local and a global community and encourage cross-cultural engagement. And what we've seen in the past 70 years, when we approach the world, our communities, and each other from this mindset, we are able to build bridges across divides. Without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel today and then let the experts speak. First, we have photojournalist Tish Lambert, who has a newly published book, We Protest, Fighting for What We Believe in. As I mentioned, the short video will highlight some of the aspects of that. And Tim, our program director, has posted a link to where you can purchase the book from our local partner, Broadway Books. We also have joining us Adrienne Belafonte-Bissemeyer, who's an activist and the executive director of the Near Foundation. And as I mentioned, Portland's Eric Ward, executive director of the Western State Center and a longtime partner of World Oregon. This video introduction that we're showing is from New York Times journalist and author David Shipler. And again, we're very honored to have this sterling panel. I encourage you to go to our website to see their full bios and links to their organizations. And now, without further ado, I'm going to roll the video. Bear with me as I pull it up.
The faces of America are in these pages. They are not joyful. Even the occasional thin smile has the sour taste of sorrow. Yet the rage, the stiff determination in the eyes, the lips tight in commitment, the mouths wide in some chant of defiance and hope, all combine in a pageant of inspiration. There are placards, too, with words of anger and pain, deft slogans of stiletto wit and clever contempt. But even without the words, we would have the faces, and the faces tell the story of America. Not an America lost, but an America found again by its great array of women and men who are white, black, and brown, their faces creased with age and unblemished with youth, citizens and immigrants, wounded and secure, comfortable and vulnerable, privileged and pained. They display seasoned values and impatient idealism. They call for rectitude. They demand that we see in them the country's striving for moral justice. The freedom to protest is enshrined in the First Amendment to the Constitution, but its seeds were planted nearly 6 centuries earlier in the Magna Carta, which codified the right of specific nobles to petition the king. That right, later extended by Parliament to every British citizen, became part of a deep heritage of liberty that has nourished the roots of the American idea. The American Revolution was launched not only in opposition to British rule, but also in outrage that the colonies were being denied the rights safeguarded by English law. Rebellion on that count was a backhanded compliment to England, you could say, for not meeting its own standards. The founders then drew from Britain's rich legal traditions, and in key areas the United States became heir to English common law. The right to demonstrate is one example. It occupies the heart of democracy. Along with freedom of speech, the press, and religion, quote, the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances, unquote, may not be prohibited, the First Amendment declares. That right is inherent, not granted by government. Not all street protests move officialdom, of course, but some have pushed the nation around a corner. The marches of the civil rights movement exposed the ugly cruelty of the segregationists, whose attacks on nonviolent demonstrators with fists, fire hoses, and police dogs mobilized the conscience of the country. At the massive 1963 March on Washington, Martin Luther King Jr. stirred the nation. I have a dream. The widening protests against the war in Vietnam helped tip the balance in Washington toward withdrawal. And now we have these images from the election of Donald Trump onward. They flow and merge, moving like a river of distress from grievance to grievance. Will they push us around a corner? We can't say. But savor these images of America the Beautiful. These faces will be a mark of pride when history looks back in judgment on this time.
So thank you again for joining us for today's program that will talk not only about protests here in the United States, but around the world where Tish has firsthand experience taking pictures. And I will stop here and hand it over to Tish and our other panelists.
Thank you so much, Derek and Tim and Adrian and Eric. It is such a privilege to be in conversation with you today, especially as we all are witnessing and in continued shock with what we are seeing happening in Wisconsin. So very soberly, I say that, you know, I began my project of We Protest. The genesis of this began way back in 1999. I was in Guatemala. It was the end of the Civil War there. I was on a public bus in a remote area above Lake Atitlan. There were 4 or 5 young men who were about to set up an election polling area for the upcoming Democratic election of their president post the conflict and all the struggle. that they had been going through for many, many years. Suddenly, the paramilitary stopped the bus and took these young men off the bus. It was the first time I had personally witnessed that kind of intimidation and what people are doing outside of the United States to risk casting their ballot. So I returned to the US, it was 2000, and I found the country very complacent. And then it was the disputed election of George Bush, and we began the epic divide that has now produced what I feel could be, the most unprecedented era of continued protest and activism. But we must ask ourselves today, really a sincere question: how effective is protest? And I say this because what we are witnessing today is a convergence of all the critical social issues, the prominent social justice movements that have erupted and have come out in the forefront. And we are also at the same time, as so many of us who are veterans in the world of activism, watching who we are passing the torch to. And I think what is so vital is to consider what I have been seeing on the streets. I see a combination of the real vital necessity of taking the energy and the action from the streets into the work that Eric does, which is the community. And it's not just for community meetings or town hall meetings, but it is predominantly into the state houses, the municipalities, the education boards, and especially with what we witnessed in 2018, into those that need to begin to think of running for public office. And so what we have witnessed in Portland on day 90 of this sustained action of protest, and we've witnessed this throughout the country in the past few months, we are, I'm sure all three of us on the panel today are in a state of disgust and alarm. What have we learned from this activity, from the eruption of our protest? And I would like to ask you, Eric, you have been so successful in your long time career of bringing people together. What do you think it's going to take to not just look at our activism, but look at a real remarkable sustained change on how we view each other? I think Eric is
You're muted.
There
I'm muted,
Oh.
and now I'm talking to everyone. So thank you for inviting me today. It's such a pleasure to be here. And, I know we are in a very heavy moment. Before I start, I want to recognize the two lives that were lost in Kenosha, Wisconsin. 2 days ago, I think the media is just now reporting on the story of two individuals who were participating in civil protest who were shot and killed by an armed vigilante, anti-Black Lives Matters protester. And we mourn the losses of those lives as we mourned those who lost their lives in the midst of the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The feeling can be very heavy right now. It is a hard time to hold what's happening in our world. We are in the midst of a global recession, right? Over 40 million Americans out of work. We have lost over 175,000 Americans to COVID-19, large-scale civil protest, and one of the largest tests that our democracy has ever faced is occurring around us. I have a bit of hope, though, and I want to talk about this hope, which is this: that in many ways, what we are facing is a backlash, and a backlash towards 70 years of civil rights gains. Now, I'm not here to paint a pretty picture in terms of this. We have a long way to go to achieving equality, but I also want to recognize those who have come before us, who have helped us get to where we are today, which is really the question, the existential and essential question in America, which is who's an American and what does America look like? And it is a question about whether we choose inclusion versus exclusion. And I think the majority of Americans are seeking inclusion, but don't quite know what to do. And so in building coalitions, what I say is that coalitions have to be built in such a way that everyone knows and understands, right, that they have a place in the world that we are trying to build. And that world is simply this, one that is grounded in the belief that everyone, regardless of whether you're a 72-year-old white male veteran struggling for work in Eastern Oregon, or whether you are a 17-year-old trans Latina struggling for a job on the streets of Portland, that both of them and everyone in between has the right to live, love, and work free from fear. That has been the essential debate in our society. It is playing out on the bodies of Black lives in this moment, but it is a debate for all of us. And in the place we are building, we think that everyone does have that right to live, love, and work free from bigotry, that it's a non-negotiable. And that's a value. That's not a political ideology. And so the first thing we need to understand in bringing folks together, we have to understand that ideology is not as important as the values that we hold in a society. And we don't spend enough time talking about what values we have in common. And because we don't do that, it allows politicians and others to manipulate our ideological positions in ways that lead us to believe that we don't have common values. The second is that we project our understanding on the world against other people's realities. And so when people talk to us about the discrimination they face in society, the level of racism that they experience each and every day, our assumption is because we don't experience that is not their reality. In building large communities, we can't lead in trying to force other people, right, who are experiencing real burdens in our lives, that they aren't experiencing that because we aren't experiencing that. Inequality has no place in strong community. But the third, right, beyond the belief that everyone has a place, beyond the belief of no longer leading with our assumptions of the world, but the reality that people live in Oregon is this. The third is that we have to be curious and courageous in our conversations with one another. We cannot be afraid of disagreement. We cannot be afraid of not seeing the world in the same way, right? We have to lean in and to try to find a new, what I call a radical center in America. And a radical center means a place where we get to come with curiosity, a place where we seek the common good, not at the expense of not addressing inequality, right? But understanding that that is the place where inequality goes into the shadows where it belongs. Building community is about believing in one another and believing in the experiences that the most vulnerable in our society experience. And we can do that. We are at such a moment in our society where we can have the promised land that we said we have always wanted, a place without fear, a place without want. This is not about scarcity. We are a nation of abundance. And we are at the top of that mountain looking into the promised land. We simply have to build the will to move into it. What we are experiencing now is a backlash. It's a backlash against those of us who believe in a real society grounded in fairness and opportunity. moving over that mountain is what it means to build real community in this moment with one another.
Absolutely. You know, one of the things I have to remark on, and you know, Adrian's been a part of my journey as a photojournalist. She's contributed to the book, and one of her comments, Eric, is, you know, I feel, you know, really from the heart what you're saying, because out on the streets, that's the message I'm getting with my camera. My work focuses on the individual narrative, and whether it's the narrative of the mothers who we don't know of, who've lost their children, who have been with me in times where they don't really want me to take their picture, they just want me to understand, or what Adrian wrote in my book about passing the torch to our younger generation, because, you know, honestly, they want to put this chapter of our society away. They want us all to come together and to rebuild, not just in terms of our societal deficit, but also we have got to deal with the environment. We have to deal with unifying each other from a different perspective. So I'm very inspired by your work also within the immigrant community, because what you said, and also what David Shipler says, which is mobilizing the conscience of America. We will not be able to do that until we identify that we are a diverse nation. And so do you think, Adrian, and you can speak to this from your legendary legacy of being brought up in the movement that taught all of us what activism was about. Do you feel that this is a last vestige of holding on to this white, perhaps a group of affluence where we're identifying ourselves, we and them, or us and them? When is that going to change?
Well, a couple of things, and thank you, Tish. One is there's clearly change. Statistics are showing that the minority will be the majority in probably 25 to 30 years. One of my disappointments is that I won't be here to fully realize that. I'm the senior citizen of this moment. And so comes with that is fear. So we are in a moment of white fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of becoming the minority. Now, true, part of my protest experience has to do with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. And for over 50 years, South Africa was ruled by a white minority. And the kinds of behavior from the present administration and those who support it is very much the same headset as the apartheid government of South Africa way back when. And, you know, any adult now is very familiar with Nelson Mandela, familiarly called Madiba in South Africa and by people who knew him. But I think this is also a moment to, especially for those that are in protest now, to look back at history and to really look at what happened surrounding Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and the NAACP, which had a much earlier start. But there's a big difference between what's going on now and what happened then. This is a movement, a reaction. This is very, and not using the word negatively, this is a very reactionary movement. People are fed up. People are dismayed. I do think that Donald Trump is right in one thing that he said, which is he's done more for Black people than Abraham Lincoln. And that's right. He's brought out the anger. He's brought out, he's made Black Lives Matter a global name, and in a positive way. That's about the only thing I can thank him for. But with that, as I said, going back and looking at the history, Dr. King was not reactionary. It was planned. Every step of the civil rights movement of the late 50s and into the late 60s was a strategic move. Very few people know of Claudette Calvin, who really was the first woman. She was a teenager, so there's youth involvement, and she just said, "I'm tired, I'm not moving." And so you can Google her, but nobody really knows who she is. She never made it to fame. Rosa Parks, however, is famous because she was strategically placed. She knew exactly what she was getting into and has to be applauded for being a warrior. She's definitely a warrior. But they planned that particular sit-in as the start to all of the sit-ins and the bus boycotts and things like that. There was training. All the students were trained, and it was a young people's movement. A lot of high school and college students who did the freedom rides, and they knew that there was the possibility of death involved, and they also knew for sure that they'd probably be wounded in some way. But they were trained by members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the NAACP. And there's plenty of documentaries on YouTube showing how the trainings were done. That's one little piece that I think is probably missing, that's adding to the chaos that people are feeling now. But the energy is there, and I applaud everybody involved on what I perceive as the good side, the wanting of positive change. But I also think some history lessons need to be done with the young people, looking at how it was done in the 60s.
Eric, do you see in the streets of Portland today more of an unbridled chaos, or do you see a uniform focus on showing up every day? And I think this is an important note in comparison to perhaps what I'm seeing, because where we are in the rest of the country is we have been viewing those hotspots that have perhaps set the tone of what we're looking with what is expected out of the Black Lives Matter protests. And with that, I mean, what are you expecting out of these protests?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I were just going to share from feeling, right, a non-strategist thing, I think I'm not alone in the sense that I think all of us are expecting everything from it. And it's quite a burden for that young Black leadership to carry right now. That's a lot to ask of folks who are primarily right under the age of 20. But I think this is where Adrian is right, is exactly on point, and in the sense that we think of the 1960s civil rights movement. I'm a person who sits between two movements, right? I was way too young, right, for the civil rights movement. Probably not too old for the movement for Black Lives, but it's a generation behind me in many ways, and I reflect on that the young leaders of the 1960s civil rights movement, I think, had to carry some of the same burden, and there are lessons there. There are, I think it is a very difficult moment, right? The backlash, the violence that protesters are facing are quite similar. I think we have too quickly turned away from understanding and debating the role of mass nonviolent civil disobedience within our movements. I think we haven't asked the question about what does it mean to build in this moment. And while a large percentage, right, I want to be clear, and I think it's hard for folks to hear, but the far, far, far majority of the protest has been nonviolent. But there have been incidences of looting and vandalism. The movement for Black Lives is not the cause of that looting and violence. But neither are we as movement leaders completely, are we completely free of having to contend with what that means surrounding these moments. And so I think we're seeing a couple of things that are important. The first is that we really, the demand is actually so simple, not very complex. And the demand is simply this, right? Which is to stop murdering Black people in America. It's not a huge ask of a democracy. And saying Black Lives Matters shouldn't be a controversial thing. And that it is so hard to say tells us a lot about the moment that we are in right now. And it is equally true that those of us who are working not just for Black folks to get free, but we understand it is the crux of how all of us get free. It's how we all move away from inequality, to understand that our leadership has to be expansive in this moment, right? This is not just about leading our Black communities. This is about leading everyone who wants to struggle for racial justice in our society, and helping them to do that in ways that build the type of society we want. I would just say, after 500 years of white supremacy, the one thing that we know is that core of white supremacy is violence and destruction, right? It is what happened. It is that violence and destruction that Native people faced. It is that violence and destruction that the Irish and the Italians faced. It is the destruction that Blacks and Latinos face, and that Muslims face in our society as well. I'm a believer of Audre Lorde, who said, "You cannot use the master's tools to destroy the master's house." And this house was built on violence. We don't get to move on through the use of violence, but mass scale, large scale civil disobedience that we are seeing across America right now is, I think, critically important in this moment. And I understand it's critically complicated. And so we can't over romanticize the street protest. There are other things that need to be done as well, right? So for those who don't want to march, there is litigation to support. There are phone calls to be made. There are letters to send. There are neighbors to talk to. And simply because we don't like the few folks who are causing some destruction is not an excuse to abdicate all of our responsibilities. This is about making a better America. And those of us who came before us laid down their lives to give us the chance to make that better America. The Martin Luther Kings, the Fannie Lou Hammers, the Malcolm X's, they sacrificed a lot to get us into this moment. And we as responsible leaders have to take that seriously. We can't waste that. We need to build the society we say we want America to be. And I don't think we get there by burning it down. I think we get there, how the movement for Black Lives has shown us, is through building power, building large-based coalitions, having hard conversations with even those we disagree with. And I think that leadership is inspiring to me. It's what keeps me going.
What?
Tish, if I could jump in for just
Yes,
a second, I want to support Eric on that. That we have a very different kind of revolution movement going on right now than what happened in the 60s and 70s and 50s, I'm sorry. And that is, they didn't have to contend with social media. They didn't have to contend with conspiracy theories and acceptable lies. As someone said to me the other day, I don't know what an acceptable lie is, except apparently they're out there. And so the young people who are organizing today also have the advantage of using social media, but it's also the thing that's calling the others out also. And also during the Dr. King's movement, there seemed to have been a clear us and them. Whereas now things are infiltrated, and it's more than, was it the Black Klansman, where you can do it just over the telephone. When you have everyone wearing a black hoodie, but yet they want to cause anarchy, they want to deface Black Lives Matters and other peaceful movements by causing riots and destruction. I think the primary thing, which I believe, please correct me if I'm wrong, Eric, but that Black Lives Matters started with, let's look at police brutality and misled police all over this nation. But when the police stand by as recently as the last couple of days and allow this kind of thing to go on, we watched again a violent act live of an African American, and then last night a teenager was allowed to carry a weapon, the open gun laws, and walk in and shoot in the crowd. The police allowed it. And so it's making sure that the message we want is a clear one, that everyone can at least understand the message. Whether they agree with it or not is another thing. But I think that part of what's happening for those who aren't really into it but are concerned and interested is not everybody is clear on what the message is any longer. I think we have to get back to really specific parts. There's a lot to it. It's more than one message, but you have to have a foundation message and make it clear to the entire world.
Intrinsically, what I find, because I have covered protests now for over 2 decades, I feel a couple of things with the escalation of both the chaos and almost the possible demise of the forward motioning of our activism when we go back consistently to where we start, which is, are we having protest fatigue? Are we feeling individually that our voices actually can come together within the movements that we're all discussing? I think we all know what's at stake. We all know this isn't an America we want to be handing over to our children and grandchildren. And yet there feels like a fundamental disconnect for me out on the streets when I photograph this, of the rage, of the eruption, of the expectation. And then we are witnessing, as we return to what could be the actual creation of legislation and bringing it into our communities, and we have these repeated events again. So, I mean, Eric, I think to myself, and also Adrian, it's not only what will it take, but really and truly, it's a decision, I think, everybody who is opening their mouth about anything has to firmly state this is just not acceptable. And the liftoff point has to be, as you said, stop killing. And is that a electoral message, or is that a humane message? I mean, is that a message that goes to the core of whether or not you're ever going to adapt that kind of humanity?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to for our children. I mean, anyone who wants to take America, right, down the path that we see from, that has been described by white nationalist leaders, by armed paramilitary, vigilantes, that is a path of nihilism. And that nihilism is not life. That nihilism is death. I know America often gets accused of for its exceptionalism, right? But I would just ask folks to stop for a second and to think about all the things that have just happened over the last 6 months, right? We're not even talking about the Tree of Life shootings, or the church with Black worshipers in in Charleston, South Carolina, right? Or the Latino community that was gunned down in a Walmart in El Paso. I'm just asking folks to just consider the last 6 months, right? And ask yourself, true or false, if the media was reporting on this, right, in another country, right, they would be calling it a political crisis, right? They would be talking about armed paramilitary troops, right, that are functioning on the streets of America. We would be talking about the early stages of ethnic cleansing, of ethnic riots, right? That is the language that would be described. We would be, if this were in another place around the country, around the world, we'd be talking about a possible failed democracy, right? That is likely the language we would use. And I think American exceptionalism has really put us to sleep in ways that are dangerous, not only to Black lives, but to America itself. We are completely underestimating the moment we are in right now. We look at it as a form of curiosity or interest, something that's like happening on a movie screen. But this is actually happening around our lives. Like, let's be clear. There has been clear, right, regardless of what we think about law enforcement, or defund law enforcement or not defund law enforcement, we can at least admit that there has been a level of biased policing, right, towards protesters, right, who support Black Lives Matters, than the other side. And that's dangerous to a democracy, right? That is dangerous to us, right? Let's be clear, most of the folks who have been injured, right, in these protests by either law enforcement or vigilantes, right, those victims are largely white, right? Those are white America's children who got shot down in Kenosha, who were beaten and fired at in Kentucky, right? Who were shot at, and shot in Phoenix, Arizona, who were attacked on the streets of Portland, Oregon. There is one truism. I've studied and helped communities organize against the white nationalist movement for nearly 30 years, right? There is one truism, that most of their victims are white, right? That is the truth of that movement. And we are allowing, because we think that we have to pick either one side or the other, we've decided then we don't want to speak. But all of us have to speak out in this moment. We have to speak out for our values. We have to speak out for the society we say we want. And we have to understand this, that these young Black people who are marching on the streets, right, and those who are joining them are simply saying, stop killing us, right? Like, we can't hide the statistics. The data can't be hidden. The video can't be hidden. There is a disproportionate amount of violence that Black America faces from law enforcement that is just simply unjust. And if we sit here today and say we don't believe defund the police is the answer, then we have to put up some other answer, right? And there is no, sadly, neutral position in this moment. If we don't like the answers that are being put forward, then the responsibility is on us to put those answers forward and then to act on them accordingly. We can't ask Black Lives Matters to stop what they're doing because we don't like their idea. And that's so needed in this moment. And we don't have very long to do it with. And it doesn't take very long. It only took 5 years for folks to start wearing seatbelts in this country. It only took 10 years for folks to cut down on their smoking in very significant ways. This isn't about that we can't do it. It's building the national will, and it doesn't do it. We can't build that national will. If you actually are sitting here right now listening to us and thinking that Black people are actually treated fairly in America, right? That does not move us forward. It is not honest. It is not fair. And our children deserve a fair society. All of them, regardless of their race. They all should have an opportunity. It is selfish of us, right? It is selfish for us to continue to allow our country to function in the way that it does. It's dangerous.
It is dangerous. And Adrian, you know, it brings to mind, you know, Eric, I can't tell you how that strikes me, because I also want to say, if you can't come to grips with that, you're part of the problem. And I hate to point fingers because I shouldn't be pointing that finger. But, you know, Adrian was sharing yesterday, she spoke to her dad about the moment we're in. Adrian, tell us, what did he say regarding where he thinks we're at?
Well, I had commented that I felt that maybe if he's 92, I'm 93, sorry, right now. And I said, you know, very lovingly, but if he had passed under the Obama administration, that he could have left feeling they had made it to the mountaintop. But to have experienced what he did, which was basically spend his life on civil rights and you know, civil justice globally, but specifically here in the US. And he said, no, I'm really thankful for being able to be here for the start of the real revolution. And that he is energized by Black Lives Matters and by young activists. And for a long time, he was still holding court for these young people who are active. And he's not doing much in the way of public speaking or even interviews right now, but he is sitting back and watching. The only thing he watches is the news, which would drive me personally nuts. But for him to see white children as well as Black children out there going, Black Lives Matters, women's rights matter, our right to be who we are as individuals matters. So I think there's a great deal of hope coming from someone his age and his experience, not at all being disheartened, but energized. My daughter, who's also in your book, said to me at one point that the problem with a lot of us old folks, meaning me, is that we hoped that the civil rights movement would have been the end all, that we really would get to the mountaintop. And she said, no, it's been phases, right from the first slave running away in the 1600s. She said, the civil rights movement goes in phases, and we're just really starting another phase. A few feet, maybe just an inch is made from phase to phase, and a big leap. There's a lot of stuff, good stuff, that is now possible. you watch interracial couples in restaurants. Well, back in the day when we could go to a restaurant, but you would see them and not think twice about it. And then commercials started with mixed couples, young Black women with white guys looking at the pregnancy test, or an old couple of a mixed culture eating breakfast together, Christmas ads going one right after the other, clearly two male couples with children. So
America.
we can't, we really can't say, oh, nothing's changed. A whole lot has changed, not nearly enough, but we do make progress each time one of these things starts up. And so now it is very important for us to have significant movement with the Black Lives Matters and the young people. I'm talking the non-African American, non-Hispanic, although it's wonderful to see the Hispanics involved and very necessary, but also Native Americans, First Nations involved. Now that we have all of us looking at the issue, it is very hopeful.
So Tish, this is Tim DeRoche popping in. I want to give people a chance to ask questions. And I'm going to kick us off with, Eric, you sort of pointed toward this a little bit in terms of talking about international protest and political crisis and how it gets framed. And Tish, I know that you have also, well, and Adrian, I mean, your work in South Africa, and Tish, you've been in the DRC. What do we learn from this moment, or what's the sort of back and forth that we can find commonality with say the Hong Kong protests? What's going on in Belarus right now? Because I see it as a rising tide of reaction against a sort of a populism or a polarizing authoritarianism.
I mean, this is Eric. I mean, I think people are not everyone, right? But I think that there's growing concern about the rise of authoritarianism again globally. I think coupled with just the extremes and inequality, right? We feel it here in the US, right? On one hand, 40+ million people out of work in just the last 5 months, yet the most wealthy in our society are making record profits, right? Jeff Bezos became the first trillionaire, right? Became a trillionaire at a time when like 40+ million Americans have lost, right, their earnings. And so you think about that level of inequality, you think about the rise of authoritarianism that's needed to keep that kind of inequality in place. And, there's a third piece, which is, across the world, right, people feel alienated, right? Alienation is such a key component of authoritarian rule, making people feel afraid of one another, feeling separated from one another, not close to one another, unable to know how to be curious or excited about one another, right? And there is no coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence that has grown as a result of the lack of leisure, right? We are a country that fought for the 40-hour work week. Now most Americans are working 70 hours a week, sometimes 2 to 3 jobs at a time, right? Our children have no free time. Every hour of their day is accounted for, right? We are in our own bubbles in terms of the news we read, right? And that creates alienation and isolation. And one of the things I think I've learned about the global struggle against authoritarianism is the need to build connections with, right, that personal relationship, even with those you disagree with politically, are critically important. We saw that when Nelson Mandela, whether we agreed with it or not, sat down with de Klerk. That's where that lesson comes from. The need for joy and celebration, right, is an incredible part of our struggle. We see that in the Black Lives Matters movement and these young people, right, who have as much joy as they have rightful rage in this moment. And then the third, I think, is pushing back against authoritarianism. And the way we push back against authoritarianism in this moment, right, is to understand that democracy, democratic practice, right, people-centered, transparent, accountable government is still the best form of government that has yet to be created. And we should not be so quick to turn our noses at it because it has been misappropriated by others, right? That practice is what ultimately defends and keeps us safe from authoritarianism. And that's what I've learned looking at Belarus, looking at Hungary, Ukraine, right? And other places, Brazil and other places around the world.
You know, Eric, I just have to jump in to say this brings me to that moment I had in the Democratic Republic of Congo in rebel-held territory with women and children physically risking their lives to go out on a dirt path with a sheet painted to basically stop killing us, stop domestic violence. And the one takeaway was I was the only person there with my camera to record that moment. And to me, what you're saying, if I could bring it from the large umbrella down to the individual pinpoint, I must say it's the triumph of the human spirit that educates and enlivens all of us to feel that it isn't a hopeless venture for us to protect our brother and to be there and to demand what you said, stop killing us. Whether, you know, I think all of us, we look at Belarus, you know, it's back to the days that perhaps we all had thought were behind us with what we're fighting against with authoritarianism. And Adrian, you know, you have seen the same repeated battle throughout Africa. And I just, before we leave this conversation, I do want to quote I want to read what Harry wrote for my book. And then Adrian, maybe you can comment on this. I graciously, well, I'm very gratified to have this closing my book. And Harry states at the end of my book that the human family can no longer afford to resist the fullest embrace of peace. Without such an embrace, especially in these critical times, we are ensuring humankind's extinction. And with that, I want to say to you, you know, Adrian, you are an ambassador of the world and you fight for women and children with your work. I know I document that fight. That's where my place is in this conversation. So perhaps a last moment with you on that.
Well, I feel your work, and particularly your book, We Protest, is that's the important part, because people need to see the visuals. There is something very important, and especially I feel, you know, with Eric, who is in the throes of it right now. It is easier for me to expound on history and talk about things that I've done before. But those are words that can either make a point or be fleeting. But the picture, there really is something to, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Sometimes the pictures make mistakes, but I don't feel that coming from your book and your work. The life that you've put into it, and definitely my applaud to Eric, as I said, being in the thick of it right now. That's what keeps the movements going. That's what energizes. People need to see that there are others before them and with them. And so the book is a very important piece. And Eric, I applaud you. And Mr. B will applaud you too.
He's going to. Thank you so much. And to everyone out there doing amazing work, and to the generation even behind me, they inspire. They just inspire me.
So I'm going to bring us back around with one last question before we have Derek jump in and send us off on our merry way. Yesterday when we were talking, I was struck by something I think that Adrian said about we need a revolution in how we fight. And I have a question here from Diane, who says, we know that protest can feel affirming and empowering, in particular because you are with many, sometimes tens of thousands of strangers who feel similarly. What would you say is affirming and empowering about other forms of civic engagement that aren't as spontaneous or readily accessible as street protests?
Well, I have to first of all say we are in an era of the citizen journalist. And in fact, that is really what everybody has in their power with their devices. So the protest is the witnessing and then the messengering. And that can, sometimes come with great courage, as we saw with these last police killings and shootings. But I think to further answer that question, what I think is vital right now is we take the action, the sport of protest, and we immediately tie it into what I said earlier, which is the real reality of identifying our civic engagement in a practical way with it. So for everybody listening out there, I think today's protests, it's just the ultimate action is making sure everybody has registered to vote and that everybody is voting. And more important, I know we've heard this forever and ever now, but be a poll worker if you can. But we are in an age where we're going to be examining, as Kamala Harris says, what we did at this moment. And I think the protest of this moment is actually getting us to put this time in our society behind us and to move forward. And I feel that ultimately it does rest on each individual person's shoulders.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Derek. Really rich, fantastic conversation. And I can't thank all three of you enough.
Thank you, Tish. That was a great way to sum up. And as a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that partners with great panels like yourself and organizations like the Western States Center, not only for the benefit of our local community here, but the international community that we are privileged to be able to host in person or currently virtually, it's wonderful to have this conversation. Thank you to the larger audience attending today. We have those in attendance not only from our World Oregon audience here, but through the World Affairs Councils of America throughout the United States. Encourage you to take a look in the chat function. We have posted links to some of the YouTube videos for our previous programs, including one that Eric was on previously, and also a link again for Broadway Books for Tish's book. You can also just go straight to Broadway Books website or Tish's. And also posted a link for the documentary about Adrian's father that is currently showing for free on Vudu. You can stream that since you've probably already exhausted Netflix during this Lime home. It's wonderful to have, again, all of you here. I would encourage you to join us for our upcoming programs. We have one this Sunday. Our Young Professionals group is having a long reads club where they discuss a long-form journalism article. This one is about China's repression of the Uyghurs, a critical human rights issue of our time. And then in September, we have some really interesting programs coming up with two longtime presenters that are very popular with our audience. Mel Gurtov, the former Portland State University professor, on his new book, America in Retreat, analyzing the foreign policy of the Trump administration. We have about the button, the nuclear war issue from Truman to Trump with former Secretary of Defense also coming up in September. And then just added one of our most popular programs of the pandemic so far was with Christopher McKnight-Nichols, an OSU professor from Oregon State University, who's looking at a further lesson on the 1918-1919 pandemic, which, is really, as we referred to in this program, is the back through this incredible moment of social change. So thank you again to our illustrious panel, and really appreciate all your time here today, and wish everyone a good day and that you stay healthy.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
Thank you so much.